All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of A Sip of Knowledge with Liz Rhodes, Bryson. Almost got your names covered there. And this special guest, Jay Erisman of New Riff Distilling, who I'm going to let your host give an extended introduction to in just a moment. Before I turn things over, I'm Will Hookinga from Davy.co, and as always, just want to show you a few different ways you can interact with each other, with your hosts, your guests throughout the show today. So on your right, you'll see a chat box. Feel free to say hello. Let us know where you're joining us from in the world. If you have a question at any point for any of your hosts or for Jay, there's a little button at the bottom of the screen that says ask a question. So just hit that button, type your question in, send it in. I'll be keeping an eye out for those and relaying them over to your hosts. And last but not least, feel free to invite your friends to join us. There's a share button at the top that makes it easy to do that. But with that out of the way, Liz, Lou, I'll turn
Thanks,
things over.
Will. Much appreciated. Welcome to A Sip of Knowledge. We are now firmly on a 2-week schedule. So last time we saw you was 2 weeks ago. Next time we're going to see you is in 2 weeks, which is March 1st. But more about that later when we get into the wrap up. My name is Lou Bryson. I'm a whiskey writer. Have been doing that for a little over 20 years. I was managing editor of Whiskey Advocate for about 20 years, and I'm now back to running freelance. I have my 2 books that I always plug. Thank you so much. Great books. I realize Christmas is over, but that doesn't mean you can't get somebody one just for fun. I always have a whiskey. Today I am drinking New Riffs. This is the Maltster series. This is a Kentucky Straight bourbon made with malted wheat. And there's actually 3 different wheats in this. It's 65% corn, 18% Bohemian floor malted wheat, 10% unmalted wheat, and 7% dark wheat. And as I mentioned before the show, it is just wildly aromatic. Looking forward to this. So, Liz.
Awesome. Thanks, Lou. Also, I'm seeing a lot of excitement on the board already. So some early questions submitted. Also, a lot of people with shout outs, Donald Snyder specifically. Hey, what's up? Thanks for joining.
Hi, Don.
It's going to be a super exciting show with Jay here from New Riff. As always, I'm Liz Rhodes, technical distiller and spirit consultant. Have over a decade experience in alcoholic beverage, spanning across several different sites and product types, including beer, rum, vodka, RTD, CBD, non-alc. But my particular favorite expertise, of course, is in whiskey. I spent most of my career at a tiny mom and pop shop known as Diageo. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe not. That's okay. But am currently founder and principal at Spirit Safe Consulting, as well as newly enrolled at the beginning of the year, director of whiskey ops and R&D at Whistlepig Whiskeys. So wearing several different hats, but of course, whiskey being the main theme, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Specifically, again, with Jay here from New Riff, and I'll toss it back over to Lou to make that intro.
Thank you, Liz. Jay, welcome. Good to have you
see you, Lou.
You are the vice president of strategic development. Is that your title? Is that right?
That's a title. Yeah, that's what they call you when they don't really know what you do. Can't describe it. Maybe a better title is co-founder of New Riff.
Right.
Right. I've been here from the beginning, and a much looser title is Whiskey Man. I was responsible for the creative and the whiskey end of the business.
The part of that I always love, though, is that you always point out that you're also the gin maker.
I am the gin maker. Yeah. To the extent that I run any still here or anything, it was. I helped with the whiskey, but primarily leave that to people better at it than I am. I'm the gin distiller, and when we wanted to create a gin, and I did, then that was my baby, if you will.
Cool, very nice. So the first thing we always ask, and the first thing that's always of interest to it, how the hell did you wind up here? And we don't need to know about your birth and early childhood, but what? What led? Yeah, right.
I mean,
know
if
you
you
really
want
wanted to get
to,
into that.
Well,
What led the adult Jay to where you are now?
a little bit of childhood probably is instructive because I
Okay.
was raised by a gin guy. My father is a martini drinker, a martini man.
Okay.
He's also a chemist, and to this day he makes his martinis in a graduated cylinder. He's probably made about 39,000 of them since 1958. And
Awesome.
I was raised by a maybe not a mixologist, but my dad knew his cocktails, and he put forward an example of thoughtful and appreciative and responsible enjoyment of same. And it wasn't shot in a beer. It was let me make this cocktail every night with care. And so I was exposed to that from my whole life and so on. So my dad even had he had a glass graduate, which of course you break because that's what you do, but he had a plastic model. That was the travel kit.
Oh my
And
God.
we would go driving across the country and get to the Holiday Inn, and the children are dispatched to find the ice machine. And then they're in the hotel room with a travel kit of gin and vermouth. He would make in his graduated cylinder the same martini he had the night before. Maybe he brought some olives, I don't remember. But so I was raised in that, and so I by the time I got into college, I had a budding fascination / passion with this stuff. I had a small Scotch collection by the time I left my freshman dorm room, and it was a passion of mine all those years. I became a home brewer, and that's what began teaching me the basics of fermentation and some production and style and things like that. But all along, I was a whiskey head first, probably. And eventually it was one of those things that turned into a job and a career. And I went to work in various segments of the industry in the later 90s. And in 2001, went to work for the amazing liquor retailer. It's right across the parking lot from us. It's called The Party Source. And I worked there as the fine spirits manager for Ken Lewis from 2001. It's 20 years ago. And I guess between what I was doing in fine spirits and working on very intimate levels with many of the great distilleries in Kentucky, launching private barrel programs and things like that, running our own experimentals, that combined with Ken Lewis's blazing entrepreneurship. Ken is one of these entrepreneurial spirits that America seems to produce from time to time. And his chosen field was alcoholic beverage retailing, and he revolutionized it. And between the two of us, he says it was my idea. I know it was his idea because I never went to him and said, Mr. Lewis, you should sell the store and take the money and build a distillery in the parking lot. We should do this our damn selves. But that's what we did, and it worked. Here we are, so that's it. We have a commitment from all of us, but from Ken on down to everyone, a quality first mantra here. The goal of New Riff is to someday be on the list of the world's great small distilleries. Sounds kind of hokey, but we know what those distilleries look like because we worked with them for so many years in retailing. So we come to this whole project with decades of experience in alcoholic beverages and whiskey, and just haven't made it before. Happily, this stuff is pretty good. So
yeah, it seems to be working out.
Yes, it is.
Now that
Before
I'm sorry,
you
go
jump
ahead.
in, I know I was going to say completely relatable because I grew up. So my dad is a PhD chemist, and my last birthday gift from him was graduated cylinder pint glasses. So your story from your childhood is relatable right to this day. So I love that.
Nice.
I was just going to follow up because we mentioned this really briefly during the pre-show get together. Right from that explanation of how you got into this and where you are today, can we flip back to what's behind you and talk about the name of the distillery and the logo?
So it says on the back of the bottle that we are a new riff on an old tradition. And the old tradition being sour mash whiskey making, and we are doing our new riff on it. Sometimes the riff is is gentle and a lilting melody, if we could use some musical terms here. Other times it is a really, really heavy riff. I think we're going to talk about some of those a little bit later. But I wish I could take credit for the name. I am a guitar player. I'm a musician. I make riffs. I play Hendrix, but I didn't think of this. It was Ken Lewis, actually. Ken is an old deadhead. When I was born, he was probably literally in the bus following the Grateful Dead, and has this 60s hippie background, and came into, if you ever had to name anything like this, it's really hard. You're trying to make a name that's different. There's no trademark issues. It's durable. It will last. And he came into our meeting, our naming meeting one day and said, I got an idea. What if they think of the distiller as a musician? And he's doing his craft, and he knows the background and the history and the tradition, but he's doing something new. He plays a new riff on it every day, and the name was struck. So that's where the name comes from. We are a new riff. We try not to play up the musical aspect. We don't really want to be the music distillery, but it rests in a deeper place than that. I think of ourselves, if I could delve into rock guitar background, we are much more like a Hendrix or an Eric Clapton, someone who blazes a new trail, but first learned and respected the tradition behind them. We are not punk rock. I like punk rock just fine. It's wonderful. Somebody had to make Electric Light Orchestra go away, and the punks did it. But we aren't here to upset the old apple cart and throw out.
Man, it's a good thing Marty's not on the show anymore. That would
220 odd years of distilling history in Kentucky. We respect that, and so we hope to become on a path to master it, and someday we might get there. The logo is a lot of fun. It has proven really durable, this little logo, and people keep finding new things in it. If I move out of the way, you can see it, and it's meant to be a sine wave, perhaps. And other people see there's also a river, and a sine wave as in a signal or something. There's an N. Do you see the N?
Oh yeah.
And there's also an R here at the end. And so people keep finding new things in it. One guy said to me, Jay, it's a vibrating guitar string. I said, damn it, why didn't I think of that? It is a vibrating guitar string. And then funniest of all, to give credit where it's due, the head of the Lexington-based Bourbon Brotherhood, we were on a Zoom call, and he looks at it and he says, Jay, I see an AF. Do you see the A right here?
Oh yeah.
And A, and there's an F. So we are Bourbon AF. That new riff.
See, I was seeing like a DNA helix. I mean, only a single.
I love that.
Yeah.
Always admired that molecule.
So this is where I wanted to ask. Well, could you put that picture up full screen of front of the distillery? Yeah. So this is the thing that struck me the very first time I saw the distillery. The first time I came there and actually drove into the parking lot and saw that, and this was, when did you start? When was the building completed?
2014 spring, and we started distilling June of that year.
Okay, so this was a time in craft distilling where, I don't know, how many places had a column still? 3?
Yeah,
maybe?
very, very few. When we opened in Kentucky, we were the first new column still in many years. I suppose the one prior to us, as far as I know, would have been the Heaven Hill plant that I think Diageo eventually owned in Louisville. And before that, you might have to go back to Maker's Mark in 1950-ish when a column still was installed. Yeah. So we were the first new one in quite a few years, the first smaller one in Kentucky. Nationally, when we were getting ready to build New Riff, we took a little took a flight out to Wyoming and went to Wyoming Whiskey, where I knew Steve Nally from his days in Kentucky, and master distiller Steve Nally invited us out, and they had an 18-inch column still, and it was, as far as we knew, the only smallish or of a size comparable to what we were going to do. And so we went out there to examine it and see how they did it. And we took Larry Ebersold, our consulting master distiller, and so there were very few column beer stills. Let us clarify,
Right.
Lou, a column beer still. Lots of people had vodka columns, but very few were running a column beer still.
Yeah, and the thing that struck me was, and this is where that whole new riff thing melds in. It is a new riff on an old tradition. I mean, because not only was every other craft distillery essentially in the country running a pot still or a hybrid and trying really hard to convince us that meant it was better. Not only you guys run the column, but you've got it right hanging out in our face. You're proud of it. You got it encased in glass. It is the showpiece of your distillery.
Absolutely.
It is, I mean, it's salient. You cannot miss it. And that was something even the old big distillers weren't doing. Usually that shit was hidden away. Nobody wanted to see it because it looked like a machine.
Right.
And here you guys are. This is it. This is what we are. I loved that. I was just, because I hadn't actually seen a picture. I just like, oh, new riff. I'm going to go and see Jay's operation here. I drove in the parking lot and my jaw dropped. I'm not shitting you, not blowing smoke. I was just so stunned and impressed. I was like immediately in love. I was like, oh my God. Sorry, I'm still gushing, but I just thought that was so striking. I mean, it was almost in your face kind of stuff. Sorry, go ahead. I'm done now.
No, it's okay. My question is, so you mentioned 18-inch diameter with some of the other sides. So let's talk size.
Mm-hmm. Ours is 24-inch diameter. It's about the same height as any of them in Kentucky. They don't tend to get shorter until you get significantly smaller diameter, and to maintain the same spacing you'd wind up with a pencil. This is 24-inch diameter. If you see the sight glasses there, that is the actual still. If you see on the sides of it, there's insulation around it. We insulated the still and clad it in copper, so it would help control the heat in the still tower, but also would look good and look nice with light shining on it and everything. So it's a 24-inch diameter column beer still from Vendome. Just like all the others, it is, as you see, copper. In fact, the entire distillation path is copper. Anytime that the spirit that the beer is hot, including the beer heater, we want it touching copper. And anytime the spirit is in a vaporous state. So we don't mind if a stainless steel line carries condensed spirit to a tank or to the spirit safe. But anytime that anything is hot, we want it interacting with copper. We didn't know, as you know, many distilleries have got stainless steel beer stills, and somewhere in the line, they've got what they think is enough or adequate copper to clean the spirit up and make good bourbon. And we didn't know what that was. We didn't want to leave anything to chance. And so we built the whole thing out of copper. Everywhere there can be copper in the distillation path, there is.
So you're going to be replacing that as it slowly
wears? Yeah, someday. And we're already having to make some repairs on it now and then. It springs a leak here and there. Our guys go in and solder it. The terrifying thing is, to replace it, they're going to have to pull it out the same way they installed it. And they installed it down the top of the tower. So that thing is going to have to go out and a new one in. But fortunately, that's a long time from now. Yeah, our hearts were in our throats as this is happening. It was a momentous day, to be sure.
So after all that, I have to ask, why? Why do it that way?
Why this? Well, we wanted to make classic Kentucky bourbon as we know it today. Obviously, you go back to pre-Civil War or pre-Industrial Revolution. Certainly before the Civil War, the pot of choice, the still of choice in Kentucky was a pot. They did not really have any column stills until after the Civil War, I believe, and there's no evidence that they did. And that, in living memory, is how you make bourbon in Kentucky, how you achieve these flavors, a column beer still and a doubler. And we are certainly not one of those distillers who believes that, well, pot stills are better because that's how they do it in cognac and so on. Pot stills are just different. They make different styles of whiskey. There's certainly some versatility with a pot, but there are flavors that are endemic to a column still doubler situation. That was what we wanted to go for. We knew, however, we didn't need to. We have a pot still. It's a 500-gallon Vendome pot. You could almost see it, I think, in that picture right there that Will has got up behind us. Our pot still, and that mostly makes our gin. We have made whiskey on it, but we didn't sort of need a pot still to be experimental and innovative as well. We got into this and realized it was far more provocative to make experimental things on the column. Every craft distiller and his sister are making little experiments on the pot still, and that's beautiful. But not so many people are doing that on a column. And so we sort of blazed ahead with that. And over the years, as you have seen already, are coming more and more of those very, very heavy riffs.
Yeah, some of that, I mean, you know, some of them, like you said, are just kind of gentle things, and some of them are freaking, I don't know, like double neck shit with twin strings. Huh? It's just, yeah. I mean, let's. I mean, we'll talk about this one, and then we'll talk about setback.
Let's dig into that. I was just gonna mention, talk about size again.
About the size of the still?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
A 60-inch, just for those not familiar, a 60-inch diameter. That's kind of like
big.
Yeah, very big, but just in terms of reflux and the flavor profile, that's coming forward. So in terms of, this is more neutral, this is not. So 42, 48, I would say, is more kind of standard bourbon. But the fact that you are in a smaller diameter, you're getting, you know, more flavor coming through. So again, back to your comment of, let's play around with column distillation, and we're getting a lot of flavor coming through because we're in that smaller diameter as well.
Right. Well, the whole distillery, you mentioned size, Liz. The whole distillery is exquisitely sized, actually, thanks to our consultant, Larry Ebersol, who helped put all this together for us. We had the tremendous good fortune to work with Larry, the best sour mash whiskey distiller in the business as far as we are concerned. And he helped spec everything here out, and as well teach us how to run it, because you put us all together, myself, our head distiller, Brian Sprance, who came to us from Boston Beer. None of us in our lives had distilled a drop of spirit. I wish I could tell you I ran a moonshine still in my dorm room. I didn't. I had a whiskey collection, but I never ran an illicit still, for better or worse. So we came into this not only with a clean slate, but sort of empty minds, if you will, to be filled with good practices. And Larry sized the distillery flawlessly. We could have had a bigger still if we had bigger fermenters, but we have 5,600 gallon fermenters. Through a 24-inch column still, you can dispose of one fermenter in one shift, a shift of labor. I've seen some other places that have the same size still and double the size of fermenters. To fill a fermenter, you back yourself into 1.5 or 2 shifts. So as we have added fermenters over the years, we added 2 of them in 2015, and I'm pleased to say we just added 3 more. So we've now got 9 5,600 gallon fermenters. Just last month, we commissioned them January of this year. And as we have added more fermenters, they're the same size. The still runs at the same rate. It's proportionally a similar rate to any much larger place. So the distillery is sized to make more or less as long as we are at this very reasonable rate. And it also runs at a rate that is something that can be handled by, drum roll please, the best part of it all. I can't quite see it in the picture there that Will has, but we have our own private water supply, our own water source. The first thing we went looking for when Ken Lewis said, let's do it, let's make this distillery, was a better source of water than the municipality, than the city of Newport. And we knew we could make good whiskey with that, because that's all they do in Louisville, is they all run on city water. We wanted something better, and we found underneath the distillery, right under our feet, 100 feet down, is an aquifer that is primarily fed by the limestone-laden hills to the south of the distillery. If you look, you're looking in this picture right there, sort of to the south, sort of south-southwest. And if you drive out of that, you go up a hill. And that hill is the end of the limestone sheet that underpins the upper half of the state of Kentucky, the so-called bluegrass region. And that's the end of it. It terminates there, and it feeds us with this fantastic water. So we have a source of water that's fantastic for distilling. It's 58 degrees cold, and thus saves us tremendous energy in green energy savings. We don't have to run gigantic chillers in order to do our processes, our cooling processes here. And on top of that, at 500 gallons a minute, it is just big enough to run a distillery of this size. Okay, we could not build a twice the size distillery and have a 33-inch or so column, because it would outstrip that water supply. So we are sized to run on that water supply.
So you said, so the recent expansion was an 800 square foot?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't sound very big. We squeezed 3 more fermenters into this space. We are in a very challenging site. We've got a parking lot on one side. We have a flood wall on the other. We really can't get very horizontal. We can go vertical, but we're very constrained. And so we tucked, it's right here actually on the screen behind Liz's frame is where those fermenters went in. We found a place right there. Found a place to squeeze in 3 more of them, and cheek to jowl, they are sitting in there, and now we make 12,000 barrels a year.
And you age there in town?
We do, yes. We have an aging facility, a warehouse campus, really, that includes our private barrel program, the warehouses, our bottling lines here in Newport. It's on the western side of town. It's not open to the public generally, although we used to do some kind of hard hat tours of it. Those went away with COVID, but I hope they'll come back soon.
And that, what are they? Are they brick?
It's a mashup of buildings, actually. The 2 whiskey warehouses are new construction. One is a 5-story rick house, and the other is a palletized warehouse that we are slowly filling up. We're going to need another one of those by this time next year, actually. And the other buildings are, I think you saw them, Lou, when you were here, are beautiful old brick buildings. You can find photos of them on our website that date back to the late 1890s, which is pertaining to a streetcar company. But today that houses the bottling line, the dry goods storage. They're full of glass and stoppers and pallets of bottles and things like that.
By the way, I meant to say something when I poured the whiskey before the show started. Thank you for the synth cork.
Yes. You are welcome. Break. Thank you for noticing. Yeah. It didn't break.
It makes a difference.
We've also had absolutely 0 corked bottles in the history of New Riff.
Yeah, I'm a synth cork fan. Yeah, for sure.
I would have gone cork if the cork salespeople's eyes didn't glaze over when you asked them about TCA. And said, how do you eliminate this? And they said, yeah, that's a question for our technical department. Meantime, so we went with a synthetic cork, and we've never regretted it. Sometimes people say, I wish there was a cork there. I get it. It's cool. It's natural. But I don't want you to have to return that bottle because it smells like cardboard. So
sure.
And yours fit too, which is nice.
Yeah.
Well.
So I think it's time to dig into the whiskeys, right? Let's talk about the lineup.
Sure. Well, we make bourbon and rye whiskey primarily. On the side of that, we generate single barrels out of each of those. And we also make on a monthly basis 100% malted rye. This just came out not quite a year ago. It's our first older whiskey. Everything we make is at least 4 years old, but the malted rye is 6. And we are committed here it is. 100%, pardon me, sneezing here. 100% malted rye. Like everything at New Riff, it is bottled in bond. And like everything else at New Riff, it is without chill filtration. So everything we do, even the gin, is unchill filtered. And all the whiskeys come out as bottled in bond. There is no 90 proof small batch. There's no 2-year-old entry level or something like that. Everything is bottled in bond. When we come out with a new and experimental thing, like here is our Balboa rye. This is an heirloom grain, an heirloom rye grain that goes into this whiskey. I don't know if it's harder to see here, but that also is bottled in bond.
Share the varietals?
Allowed to what?
Share the specific varietal?
Oh yeah, it says so right here. We love sharing things, Liz.
Oh, perfect.
Yep, Balboa is the varietal. Balboa, quite a rare heirloom rye. Heirloom corns are rare enough, but heirloom rye is hen's teeth. I mean, I can count on my hand maybe two of them, the number of heirloom ryes that I know for a certainty are out on the market. I'm sure there's more, there's people growing them, but even finding the stocks is hard. Lou, as you well know, there in your state of Pennsylvania, they have embarked on an amazing project to reclaim rosin rye.
Yep.
And that's an example of how the lengths that people have to go to typically to work with heirloom grain, especially heirloom rye. They start from a tablespoon and they grow it up and they grow it up, and it takes years to get there. In our case, we're so fortunate to be working with an astounding farmer, a fellow in Indiana who is trained by whiskey chemists in the production of corn for whiskey making, not just for animal feed or ethanol or anything like that. And his family had been growing this heirloom rye for many years as a cover crop. And we started working with him, and a few months into it, he casually mentioned, you know, I grow rye too. I couldn't believe it. I fell down on the ground. I got back up. And he was growing this, he fed it to animals. Some years I think he plowed it under, but he could immediately send us, 8,000 pounds of it for production, and then 24,000 pounds. And then we worked our way up to whole silos of it. And we lucked out in the heirloom rye department. But this Balboa rye is sentimentally my favorite thing I think that we make. It is, I wouldn't say it's different or better than our standard rye. Here is New Riff single barrel rye. And this is a grain bill of 95% rye, 5% malted rye. When we make the Balboa, it's 95% Balboa rye and 5% malted rye. So we're not putting in here, 20% Balboa and calling it that. Here you have a unique opportunity.
Oh, there it is.
There it is, yeah. A unique opportunity to compare apples to apples, 1-to-1. What difference does this heirloom grain make? Because it's exactly the same grain bill as our standard rye, same proof even when it's bottled and bond.
Yeah, so definitely. Full disclaimer, a bias, but I think rye is definitely something interesting, hybrid versus traditional. And there's a lot of differences between those two when we're talking flavor, agronomics, precursors to flavor, starch content, etc. So it's definitely an interesting space to play in. And again, like going back to prohibition, I know we don't, the P word, right?
Makes me break out in hives just thinking about it.
Yeah, and knowing that the whiskey tradition in the U.S. started in rye, and the fact that prohibition happened, the P word again, and of course, Canadian whiskey, right? Rye is synonymous to Canadian whiskey. And in the US, we kind of went away from it. And I think it's great that we're bringing back all those traditions, really digging into specific varietals, because it's been a wild west for rye for decades. And it's so exciting that we're kind of digging back into that and really understanding what makes sense from an agronomic perspective, what varietals, and again, how that translates to making great whiskey. So it's awesome.
Yeah. It's certainly a signature grain for New Riff. We came here wanting to have an identity as a rye house, a rye-centric bourbon distillery. We mostly make bourbon, but we make a lot of rye on a monthly basis. In fact, between a 30% grain bill rye for the bourbon, so a genuinely high rye bourbon, between that and our 95% rye grain bill, we use, I'm sure this has never happened before in the annals of Kentucky distilling, but we use about 20% more rye grain on an annual basis than we do bourbon, or than we do corn. Crazy. I mean, all the old distillers never would have done such a thing. They hated making rye. And we love it, and we make it with aplomb at the 95% rye mash bill. We have the Olympics going on right now, and they have the degree of difficulty of the skaters or the routines and things. The degree of difficulty on a 95% rye is at or near the highest in the whiskey world, if we could put it that way. And we make a hell of a lot of it. We make rye for other people too. We've been into some contract distilling here from the beginning, actually. And we do a lot less of it than we used to, but some of that is rye as well. So we've supplied rye to small and large companies alike, and we love making it. We have to run it on a 3-day fermentation. The beer goes on the bourbon beer can go on a 4-day, but rye we insist on 3 days to avoid any off flavor creation.
Should we do that last question? It seems appropriate at the moment.
Sure. So I think Donald, hey, again, he submitted a few questions, but specifically the last question was, what are some of the changing variables on your column still experiments?
Right. A good question from Mr. Snyder. We generally have got the beer still dialed in, and it runs like a top. When we opened New Riff, we were almost completely analog or no automation. The only exception was the liquid inputs to the cooker. We didn't want anyone to overfill the cooker with too much water or stillage. And so we had a set point there of a little computer logic. No touch screens, no mice, no laptops, but we had just a little bit. Over the years, once we learned to run the place with the soles of our feet, once we learned to run a distillery with our ears, you listen, then we got confident about automating certain parts of it. And so the flow of beer to the still is controlled by a digital set point. The rate of steam to the stills and to the cooker is also controlled. And now it just runs like a top. We have the only problem is putting too much rye through it, or especially when we put through a certain other mash bills. We've made a whiskey that when it came out to the world, we called it winter whiskey, because we decided calling it what it really was, chocolate oatmeal stout, was simply too confusing to too many people. That's a chocolate oatmeal stout recipe. It's a bourbon, but behind that is malted oats, raw oats, a little bit of chocolate malt, like what would go in an oatmeal stout beer. And that is really, really tough to make. We have to just go down and clean it at the end of every one of these.
I'm like breaking out into hives right now.
Ooh, yeah, oats are really hard.
I know. What the hell is, like, you guys mastered rye, or like, all right, what's worse?
Oats is way worse. Way worse. So we don't really need to change a lot of variables on the still. We could. Our still is designed with a number of little tweaks. A column beer still it's like an ocean liner. It's kind of hard to turn. It does one thing really well, but you can't make it turn on a dime. But Larry Eversole fitted ours out from Vendome with a number of little tweaks. Among them, the ability to put the beer into the still at 2 different plates. And if you put it in at the lower plate, it gives you not a bubble cap tray, but it gives you at least one tray above where the beer is going in that is spirit only. And we also have the ability to distribute reflux to any of the top 3 bubble plates, 18, 17, or 16. So we have some ways we can push the proof in one direction or another. Actually, the experiment where we did change a bunch of variables on that and the doubler and later ran it through the pot still was when we made the worst thing we've ever made, the worst tasting thing we've ever made, which was hand sanitizer. we ran our column and the doubler, and we came off of those suckers about 170 plus proof. And that was high enough that with one turn through the pot still and using the plates in the pot, we could get it up to the legal limit for hand sanitizer. So we made a hand sanitizer back in the spring of 20, like everybody else. It was the best damn hand jam in the land. Triple distilled, copper pot, hand sanitizer. And we did tweak the column as far as we could to get it really high proof.
Yeah, we still have some of those bottles of craft distilled hand sanitizer sitting around because I went out. Too. I bought them.
Yep.
And some of the denaturing agents were better than others.
Yep. I've experienced that as well.
Yeah. What else do we have on questions? The first one we got was also from Donald. What advice would you give craft distillers who are struggling to get shelf placement at retailers? Keep struggling?
Yeah, it's not easy. You know, if to a certain extent, if you're struggling, there could be so many reasons for it. And among them is, what are you making? You know, my friend Robin Robinson, who you guys know, does a seminar. He did it at some of the conferences, the HCSA, I think, and so on. And he called it "Nobody Wants to Buy Your Shit." And he's mailing in on all of the grain to glass, still to bottle, all of these monikers that so many people have made. You can get your local GNS vodka that you bottled into your local stores because it's from there. But to presume that everyone wants that maybe highlights certain people's lack of a right product. But of course, lots of people make fantastic products. You just have got to start with some of your local retailers. Hopefully you are in a struggling craft distiller in a state where that is friendly. If you're in a place like Ohio or Pennsylvania or some of the control states out there, interfacing with retailers is really difficult. They are not business people the way the Party Source is a business person. We approached, back in our day of retailing, we did a lot of direct importing, where I would go out and call up and bring to the store, clearing it through a distributor from so many craft distillers and artisan distillers all around the world. And that can be an option too. If you are making a compelling product, people out there will want to have it. And sometimes a little bit of a non-linear approach can really help. But some of the advice I give to people who are thinking about this is, now that we are here doing this, you should leave wherever you are, sell everything you have, possibly a kidney, buy a column beer still in a doubler, and move to Kentucky, because the world wants Kentucky bourbon. They want it less bourbon if it's from wherever you are. I'm sorry, you can make it in 50 states.
That's a fact.
Clear that there is one state that is far more recognizable. Heck, I still get calls all the time for bulk spirit they want in Spain. Apparently the Spanish, they don't drink so many bottled bottles of bourbon, but they bottle their own brands of bulk bourbon, just oceans of the stuff. So if you have a column beer still and can afford to put whiskey away, there is someone out there in the world who will buy those barrels of whiskey. They may or may not buy your brand on the local shelf, but this is a great state to do business in, and better than ever with our recent legislative successes.
That's a very interesting take. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't help myself, but I think that goes back to consumer education as well.
It does, yes.
Of course, Kentucky, whatever, bourbon, that's synonymous. But I think there's, like, going past that, there's still a fair amount of education. And even so, like with you guys, you're rye heavy focused. And so how does that fit in? And it's not bourbon, right? Like,
right. Well, we one reason we appreciated and wanted to work in high rye, or have rye as a concept here and an identity, was our experience retailing in the mid 2000s, when high rye really became a thing. No one heard of high rye when I was 22 years old. You know, if you were really smart, you knew about wheated bourbon. That was it. You know, there was no high rye, even though there were historically a few recipes out there that were high rye. It wasn't talked about. No one even gave out their mash bills. And when Seagram's folded in 2003, and then in 2004, two things happened. Four Roses came back onto the market with their high rye whiskey, and they told the world all about it and how it's made, and the grain bills, and as John Hansel put it one time at Malt Advocate Lou, I think you needed a secret decoder ring to figure out all of these things, and the consumers ate it up to figure out all of these recipes, OBSK and OESQ and all these things. They ate it up. It was fascinating to them.
Yeah.
It gave a flavor that they hadn't had before. And then what happens? Seagram's Indiana comes out to the world as well, suddenly you've got 95% rye. And a generation of rye consumers has grown up drinking Larry Eversold's recipe, 95% rye, thinking that's what rye always tastes like. Of course, it tastes like lots of different things.
Yeah.
But rye has come a long way. When I went to work at the Party Source over there, we had 3 brands of rye. We had Old Overholt and Beam and Wild Turkey. And I had to beg Heaven Hill to send us Rittenhouse. Finally, we had Rittenhouse. Now we've got 4. We have gone from a situation of a dearth of rye to a great many of them. And we saw the consumer just get captivated with that.
So just playing to what you just mentioned with Four Roses and the OBSQ and all the different nomenclature, I think something that we didn't talk about is the role that yeast strain plays into all of this. Because it definitely does. And again, like, you have a certain mash bill, that's fine to talk about, but yeast strain, and I always say, like, I don't make whiskey, Saccharomyces cerevisiae does. And I just want to make sure that they're doing their job. And different strains, again, within Saccharomyces cerevisiae can create a varying, a rainbow of different flavors. And I think rye is, again, something that you have one strain that has, POF positive versus not, and it creates a totally different flavor profile. So, and again, like, I don't know if that's something that you guys talk about or can talk about.
Actually, we have not ever experimented with any other yeast. We may yet. It's probably sort of the next frontier, if you will, at New Riff, but we haven't, for better or worse, done anything yet. We run on W6, I believe, is the strain, the standard SAF spirit number 6, used all over the industry, and it was what Larry Eversold recommended for us in the beginning, and we love it. It makes this stuff, and we're very happy with it, and would never depart from it. We would like, Brian Sprance and I have kicked it around. Let's finally do one. For one thing, we were afraid to do it lest another yeast come in and establish some kind of microbiological foothold. So there is that. However, we think now we could probably pull it off and safely work with another yeast, but we just haven't wished to. The stuff that we make is this flavor profile. This yeast is a relatively high fusel oil producer, so it's not here to make shrinking violet whiskey. It's here to make pretty big, bold stuff, and it's just very dialed in. As much as we admire, and I admire Four Roses, the last thing we needed to deal with here was a yeast farm. At the same time, we're trying to figure out how to make a whiskey and not blow ourselves up for the first time in our lives. So we never really were threatening to put in, an entire yeast program. So maybe someday I'll get a dunder pit going out back, and that'll be
fair. Yeah, it's just, I think a lot of people like to talk about mash bill, like to talk about water, but at the end of the day, yeast, right?
Right.
Alcohol. So
yeah, those are our friends down there.
I remember talking to an old school Belgian brewer who we were about 3 pints into the day, and he just starts says, I work for the yeast every day.
Yes.
I go to work and I do what the yeast does.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bow.
Right. In fact, he said, everything we do is in service to the yeast.
They are running the show, really. Yeah. and the bacteria. I mean, the lactic acid bacteria that is working here is critical too. We encourage that. We have open top fermenters. This is actually the cleanest distillery maybe you'll ever see in terms of all the fittings and how we keep the place. That's testament to Brian Sprance's brewing background. But we encourage and allow a microbiological flora. And fun side note, when we opened the place, of course, No one had ever made whiskey here. This is a new building, a new everything.
Right.
We didn't have that going on. And so we made our very first batches of whiskey, and they were good. They came out just fine. But in October of that year, and we started in June, with the very first whiskey we ever made was actually not a bourbon. It was a corn whiskey. We were committed to making sour mash whiskey. We never wanted to make bourbon that was sweet mashed or started up on water. So the first whiskey was almost a sacrificial victim. We made a half a batch of corn whiskey merely to obtain its stillage that then made the bourbon. So those early batches of whiskey were solid, but October of that year, later October, we come in one day and the pHs in the fermenters have plunged. And Brian is, worried, what's going on? And he calls up Larry Ebersol, Master Larry, the pH is 3.3. What's going on? And Larry said, yep, right on time. Because the microflora had established itself, reached an equilibrium with the yeast, and they get along. And the whiskey changed, and it got better.
Wow.
So from those weeks in October, we started making noticeably different and noticeably better whiskey.
That's cool.
Yeah, and I think again, just back to because I know sour mash, like that's a huge proponent of your whiskeys and your story. But again, like organic acids, those translate into esters, right? And a fruity profile, etc. And that all translates to the profile of the whiskey. And a lot of people don't realize that, but it's
this is Pat Heist's whole thing, right? It ain't just your yeast, it's your bacteria.
It's your bacteria.
Yeah,
and
it is.
Again, like I always talk about this, but your terroir and whiskey, it's not just about the field, agronomics. Again, like you're talking about heirloom varietals, fine. But your fermentation setup, your fermentation vessels, like the micro terroir makes a huge impact to your whiskey. And that's, again, like one of the things that I get really excited about, because it's like, okay, here's my house strain, but I know I have different lactic acid bacteria. I have different wild yeast all hanging out in the same, scenario. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, it's like the whole explosion in research in gut biome in medical science. It's amazing how much difference the little things make. We're going to have to wrap up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
One last question from Thomas. Based on your team's brewing background, what are some best practices or processes that you carried forward into the distilling parameters?
Oh, fun. Yeah, we allowed and have allowed so many of our background as brewer. I said I'm an old home brewer. Brian Sprance came to us from Boston Beer. Brian's probably the best brewer in Cincinnati, in greater Cincinnati. He doesn't even make beer anymore professionally. He makes whiskey, but he is a really good brewer. Probably some master level, equivalent of brewer. He made some very technically challenging products for Boston Beer. And over the years, for example, that Maltster that you're enjoying there, Lou, demonstrates our brewing background, particularly for Brian.
I am, by the way. I really am. That's good.
Comes into our work here. The mash bill on that wheat, that Maltster wheat is reminiscent broadly of a Dunkelweizen. There's a little bit of chocolate malt in there. There's malted wheat, things like that. Bohemian floor malted wheat. So we have a background as brewers. And yet I remember in the interview process when we were discussing with Brian making whiskey instead of beer, and Larry Ebersol asked him, now, what do you think about keeping clean? And Brian said, it's next to godliness, it must be clean in the brewery. And Larry said, well, not in distilleries. If brewers come into our place and they see an open fermenter and they taste it, it's full of lactic acid, and they're horrified. They think you've ruined it, because that's not how you make beer. So a great many practices are upended. That said, we like I said, we are just about the cleanest distillery you'll ever see. And for a distillery, we start from a baseline of considerable cleanliness in the fermenter. That was important. Many of the same practices and processes translate. I mean, in terms of all the pumps and pipes and fittings that everything fits into. Some best practices, just merely safety-wise, are in certain areas of the building are explosion-proof. The still house and the gauge tanks and so on, wherever we have concentrations of ethanol, those have to be explosion-proof, and that's expensive to build, but so be it. But allowing whiskey to be whiskey and beer to be beer, I think, is important. I chuckle to myself when I see a distiller out there somewhere who says, well, we wanted to make really good whiskey, so we started with a Pilsner. I love me some Pilsner. I don't want to make whiskey out of Pilsner. They are two different things.
It's too clean.
Yeah.
It's too clean, yes. Yes. There's not a bacterial culture in there. You know, lambic might make a hell of a
Yeah.
I could get into
I think
that.
Glenmorangie essentially did that when they did the.
I'm sure it's been done.
What was it? Alta. I think Lumsden referred to it as the Lambic Project. So, for what that's worth. Jay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I mean, not least of all, thank you for doing this on such short notice. I know we were
My pleasure. No, I'd love to do it
scrambling
again.
at the time, but glad that worked out. Next week we have, yeah, honestly, in 2 weeks. Sorry, right, 2 weeks, which is what we're doing from now on. March 1st, we have another short notice, but somebody who I've wanted on the show for a while. Somebody who's going to fit right in with Liz's agronomic bent. Scott Blackwell and Ann Marshall from Highwire Distilling in Charleston, South Carolina. Met Scott about 7 years ago and just have stayed in touch with him, honestly, just to talk to him because the guy is so thoughtful about this stuff. We're going to have a good time. March 1st, 2 weeks. Be there. Jay, thank you. Looking forward to getting out there and seeing the place again.
Please do.
Yeah.
Y'all
Thanks,
come back
Jay.
now, as we say here.
Good whiskey, folks.
Thank
Cool.
you.
See ya.
Thanks, Ron. Cheers.
Bye-bye.